everyone hear me? Yes. Let me start straight away with the first two slides. I think when we think of Vuillard, the first thought that comes to mind is that he is the intimiste painter par excellence, the portrayer of an intense and private world in which moments of domestic ritual are lifted from the continuum of time and transfixed in the poetic memory. Paintings such as these two, small, contained, exquisite images of quiet domestic life, painted early in Vuillard's career at the beginning of the 1890s, are for most of us what he is all about. On the left, a tiny painting, only about 6 by 13 inches from the Yale University Art Gallery, called The Kitchen, a study of some kitchen tiles, shows the kind of poetry that Vuillard could distill from the most humble kind of subject. It was painted at a time when he flirted briefly with pointillism, and his brush becomes a very personal conveyor of feeling as he builds an almost abstract mosaic of dabs and touches of very subtle colour. On the right, a slightly larger painting around the same date, around 1892, The Mother and Child, where again Vuillard achieves a mood that is quiet but intense, through the layering of blue on blue and the myriad touches of paint that seem to absorb the figures into the surrounding textures. There's something almost organic about the way that he builds up these textures in these early works, as if the figures seem to take their shape out of some sort of inchoate matter. One of the things I want to consider this evening is what it is that makes these images remain so potent for us today. Why the mood and the sense, the emotional and the psychological essence of these small and seemingly very casual pictures still have the power to speak to us so directly. And then later in the lecture, I'd like to look at some interiors from later Vuillard's career, when, as you probably know, his work was extremely different. You can think of few artists who undergo quite such a dramatic shift from one mode of painting to another. It's hard to believe sometimes you're looking at the beginning and end of the career of the same artist. And to try to explore some of the disjunctions and continuities between these two very different kinds of work. Much of the intensity of the early work has to do, I think, with what I like to think of as Vuillard's sense of interiority, by which I mean that late 19th century egocentric vision of the world, whereby one's experience and perception is to a very profound degree grounded in oneself, so that these interior scenes are a projection of an inner state with the self as the locator, definer, and identifier of perceptions. And I think the reason they still mean a lot to contemporary eyes 100 years later is that this, of course, still remains the basis of the modernist sensibility, the means by which the artist seeks to find a place for himself in the positivist world. The next two slides. For Vuillard, the subjects which corresponded in these early years most truly to his inner self were those that were to be found in his most authentic and immediate experience, the familiar and intimate world of his home, a world which, like Proust's Combray, was one of security and containment, based on the reassuring rhythms of domestic routine and centered around the presence of his mother. This is a portrait of Madame Vuillard on the right. You can see how he uses texture in this extraordinarily lush, dense way. The pattern texture of her dress, the more subdued texture of the wallpaper behind, and then the bolder patterning on the carpet in the foreground. All of it sort of melded together in this warm, mellow light. Vuillard was indeed extremely fond of his mother, and I think that sort of affection suffuses this image. He never married and lived with her until her death when he was 60 years old. On the left is another typical kind of subject of these years, the family mealtime. A slightly more complex work psychologically, I think, that spatially a little deeper perhaps, and these hunched figures silhouetted against the light in the foreground strike a slightly less benign mood than the more reassuring picture of his mother on the right. So that the range of his subjects in these years is very narrow. His immediate family, his mother who worked as a seamstress, his sister, and a relatively humble life they lived in a series of small apartments in fin de siècle Paris, mostly with rather small rooms decorated in this densely patterned wallpaper, so you get which aids this sense of interiority, of claustrophobia almost, that is seeking in these images. But despite the worldliness of his social existence, these are the years when he was associated with the Navi group. He was friends with slightly more racy artists like Bonnard or Maurice Denis or Paul Sarousier. Vuillard never abandoned this modest, well-tempered life of the moyenne bourgeoisie into which he was born. He always came home for at least one meal a day with maman. Vuillard's journals, the journals, by the way, were sealed on Vuillard's instruction at his death in 1940, and were to be kept sealed for 50 years, so they only became publicly available in 1990. And they are very interesting. Again, they vary. There's a great difference between the kind of things he recorded in this early period and later in his career. They're nearly all about his art, what he was trying to achieve, his sort of philosophical and theoretical ideas at this time. A great deal of commentary about matters of technique, very little about of a very personal nature. The musings of these years, we often feel that Vuillard is not speaking in a voice that's entirely comfortable to him. By his own admission, he was not happy with abstract theory, and I think that very often what he writes at this time reflects the more intellectual voice of his friend, Robert Lehman. But nevertheless, we do find quite an urgent quest for a subject being expressed, and in particular, the importance he attached to finding a subject that could release his subconscious, enabling him to create an image that was filled with personal resonance and not merely an objective copy of nature. Why is it always in the familiar places that the mind and the sensibility find the greatest degree of genuine novelty? He wrote about 1891. The next two slides. This attitude produced numerous small paintings, like the one we see here, another mealtime scene on the left, or the activities of Madame Vuillard's sewing atelier on the right. These little scenes of quiet feminine industry in her workshop, where women sew, silhouetted or bathed in gentle light, inevitably recall the luminous domestic interiors of Vermeer and other Dutch 17th century genre painters who were among Vuillard's early enthusiasms and whose names often recur in the pages of his journal. The art of the past always played a central role in Vuillard's image making right to the end of his career. The journals mention almost daily visits to the Louvre, often in the company of Bonnard in these early years. And Vuillard's particular admirations at this time, apart from Dutch 17th century painting, were for the great French 17th century painter Poussin and also Lesueur, and other great painters in the French tradition, Delacroix, and especially at this time, Chardin. You have to meet next to them. On the left, one of Vuillard's earliest paintings, a still life of 1888, right at the beginning of his career as an artist. He started briefly with an academic painter in Paris, and then enrolled in the more informal Académie Julian, where he became friends with Bonnard and Marcel and the other future Navi. I think you see the quiet modulations of colour, the sort of discrete tonalism clearly owes a lot to Chardin. But we also get a hint of that wonderful sense of nuance that is so characteristic of Vuillard's own more mature work. And on the right is a large charcoal portrait of his grandmother, which I think betrays his interest at this time in Rembrandt, and which is a work that Vuillard instead considered sufficiently accomplished to enter for the Salon of 1889, where it was accepted. You'll see in the exhibition downstairs that there is a smaller and quite highly finished study, another charcoal drawing for this large salon drawing. The next two slides. After these somewhat restrained beginnings, Vuillard's art soon underwent a dramatic change. The reason for this was the impact of Gauguin. First, by the tiny but celebrated painting which I show you on the left, the work which became known as the Talisman because of the status with which it was invested, and which the young painter Paul Serusier had painted under Gauguin's instruction at Fontainebleau in 1888. On his return to Paris, he showed it to his friends at the Académie Julian, Vuillard, Dumas, and himself. Then there was also an important exhibition of Gauguin's work held at the Café Volpini in 1889. 17 of his paintings from Brittany, Arles, and Martinique were shown, as well as Serusier's Talisman. The importance of this event for Vuillard is made clear in a summary of his artistic debut compiled in his journal, probably around 1905 when he was looking back over his early years. And he cites 1890 as the year of Serusier. This tiny landscape of startlingly brilliant, unmodulated planes of colour, painted on the lid of a cigar box, became the exemplar of an entirely new approach to painting, whereby colours and forms should be used expressively rather than descriptively. And as is well known, Vuillard, along with Serusier, Bonnard, and himself, were fired by their new mission, banded together under the name of Nabi, which is the Hebrew for prophets. The new aesthetic had a dramatic impact on Vuillard's painting, as you can see from the sensuous image on the right. Quite suddenly, in fact, he began to produce small, informal pictures, often painted on pieces of cardboard, in which he constructed images with uninflected planes of flat colour, bounded by strong contours. Here it looks almost as if the sensuous was to be cutting into the very cardboard support of the painting, the planes are so flat. And in a way, these paintings seem to anticipate by about 15 years the radical chromatic conventions of the pose. These paintings, I think, still appeal with their naive, even rather gauche vigour, and they were very liberating for Vuillard. But he soon recognised that in them he had not yet found his true voice. He dismissed them as petites salissures, or little dirty blotches. He was soon searching for a new way of painting that would correspond more truly to his inner self, and in September 1891 he noted cryptically in his journal, "My only desire now is the life of my soul." Have the next two. Over the next few years, he evolved his quintessential style, as you see on the left, built on dense and suggestive layering of pattern and texture, overlapping planes and spatial ambiguities with which he evokes the flux, shifting, unfixed nature of perceptual and emotional awareness. On the right, I show you a work of the same year, 1892, by Bonnard, by way of comparison. But we see the same kind of surface pattern, the same airlessness, the same overlapping of flat, decorative planes. But one senses here that it is much more to do with surface decoration, a sort of visual device, and not so deeply integral to the emotional texture of the work in the way that it is with Vuillard. The profuse layering of pattern and texture that is so prevalent in Vuillard's interiors does, of course, derive partly from the actual physical nature of his daily environment. His mother was, as I mentioned, a seamstress, and he seems to have been surrounded by lengths, patterned and textured cloths which filled the workshop. A feature which he makes a rather witty play off in the painting on the left, which is known as the betrothal. Apparently the figure with her back to us was Vuillard's sister, Marie, who married his friend, fellow Nadi, the painter, Kerr, who is peeping around one of these wallpapered screens, presumably for Madame Vuillard's customers to change behind. So now that we see that, in spite of the anecdotal and rather humorous quality of this painting, there is a sort of obsessive building of textures and stuffs which begins to function metaphorically for the interweaving of observation and of a certain kind of subjective experience. Have the next on the right. He also plays spatial ambiguity in the marvelous painting on the right, below at the cover with 1895, where we see the figure of Mellon Fellow, probably, half concealed behind a folding wood glass door. This cropping of the figure and the sense of the sort of contrived randomness in the way the composition is organized obviously owes a lot to Degas, who we are greatly admire. But the overlapping forms can also be viewed in the context of the then very current ideas of the philosopher Henri Bergson, who was a very influential figure in the formulation of symbolism, both in painting and in writing. So the painting like this embodies the notion that there is no fixed perceptual reality, since consciousness itself is fluid and defined by emotional states. Or perhaps like fragments of conversations overheard simultaneously, Vuillard's composition suggests the incidental, unfixed nature of the way we perceive our surroundings. The effect of this is to provoke a subjective response in us, the viewer, to invite us to share with the artist a sense of something familiar to us, but which is somehow relived and even intensified in the painting. It's rather like when you read a very compelling passage in the novel, and you have the sense that this is somewhere you've been. I think this is what's going on these paintings of Vuillard. Next two, please. On the left, we are in Mother, and on the right, another wonderful painting, Under the Lamp of 1892. Again, as with the cupboard, which we were just looking at, here the wallpaper, fabric, and figures are distinct and yet seem to merge, forming a dense, interlocking structure which belies realistic appearances, but is more attuned to the experience of subjective vision, the way that the armchair looms right in the foreground plane there. While the mobility of perception had, of course, been explored earlier by the Impressionists, with Vuillard it assumes an additional weight of personal meaning through the power of memory, with which he sought to enrich his perception of the present with associations from the past. The role of memory was absolutely crucial to the way Vuillard created such potent images from the fabric of everyday life, so that his perception of what he sees around him becomes layered with a whole body of associations and references drawn from the reservoir of his memory. Here then, the layering of colour, pattern and texture become metaphors for the resonance of past and present experience. Working from memory was in fact a key aspect of all of Manabi's working practice. As early as November 1888, Vuillard had recognised its importance when he wrote in his journal, "It is absolutely necessary to work above all from memory." A thought he expanded on a couple of years later when he wrote, "And pleasure is in the very moment, but immediately afterwards there is the memory, and this must merge with the initial perception." He discovered that by distancing himself from the motif, he could unlock pre-associations stored in his memory and now allow them to be absorbed into his final interpretation. Bergson's theory that a sudden intuitive experience can release from the unconscious memories of past experience was also of great relevance to Manabi, and is echoed directly by Vuillard in the journal when he likens the act of giving pictorial expression to the subject to a state of grace or epiphany. And in addition to this, suggestion is also the mechanism by which inner feelings and associations can be released from the unconscious mind, an idea which can be compared to Proust's theory of involuntary memory, which of course is also related to Bergson. Just as in À la recherche du temps perdu, a morsel of madeleine soaked in tea can unlock the whole of Proust's childhood of complex, so Vuillard allows sensation, or his initial visual response to a motif, to release a capsule of association from his memory, allowing the past to be absorbed into the present. The suggestive yet inexplicit levels of meaning of Vuillard's painting also have close parallels with the poetic theory of Mallarmé, another key figure in the Symbolist movement, who believed in the gradual, suggestive unfolding of meaning, and that to describe an object was to rob it of its mystery. Can I have the next two, please? On the left, two paintings from the Museum of Modern Art, the family of the artist on the left, and on the right, the mother and sister of the artist. In the main, we are eschewed the more rarefied, excessive symbolism adopted by some of the other painters, the occult or religious subjects, for example, you find in Mr. Neat, or its Wiesmannian deference. But in a few works painted around 1891 and 1892, we see him departed from his familiar mood of domestic tranquility to strike a more disturbing note. For example, the extraordinary family of the artist here on the left looks more like a scene of cannibalism than a pleasant family dinner. On the right is the grandmother holds aloft a baguette like a weapon, while the other members of the family, the grandmothers, hunched in a menacing posture, and you can just make out the rather timid face and presence of Vuillard struggling to make an entry into this room. The whole thing is the drama of the whole situation is greatly enhanced by the backlighting from the guttering candle you see casting this lurid yellow light over the wall in the background. And in the mother and sister of the artist on the right, also something strange, something very strange and taut, to say the least, about the mood here. Apparently, Marie and Madame Vuillard didn't actually get on terribly well, but even so. And instead of the rich interweaving of fabric and wallpaper, which lends such an air of warmth and density to most of these materials, here the etiolated figure of Vuillard's sister seems to be sucked into the devouring vegetation of the wallpaper, while the mother assumes a menacing, almost masculine pose, reinforced by the bulk of the chest of drawers behind. Such scenes with their underlying mood of conflict and anxiety make you think of Munch, I think, whose works we are new. But there is perhaps another less obvious Scandinavian connection, and that is the symbolist drama of Ibsen and Strindberg. May I have the next two? Vuillard was involved in the avant-garde theatre in Paris in these years, especially Lumière Poe's Théâtre de l'Œuvre, founded in 1893. And this was through its fringe theatre, which put on the first productions in France of the days by Scandinavian writers such as Ibsen and Strindberg. Like most of several of them, in fact, Vuillard designed both sets, theatrical sets, and programs for the theatre. On the left, I show you a lithograph, which was the design for a program of Ibsen's Le Soutien de la Société. You can see how he's using this lithographic medium to convey a sort of brooding atmosphere, a sense of inner drama that oppresses the figures who seem to emerge and retreat into the shadowy domain of consciousness. But perhaps even more important to Vuillard were the plays and writing of the Belgian symbolist playwright, Maurice Maeterlinck. Maeterlinck expressed in his writing, especially in his strange but compelling collection of essays called Le Trésor de l'Humble, The Treasury of the Humble, published in 1896, the belief that the mysterious and the tragic exists beneath the surface of all objects in everyday life. And I think that Vuillard's familiarity with this sort of symbolist literature, particularly Maeterlinck, led to certainly rather unusual paintings in his work, like this little one on the right, which he entitled Mystery. The objects in this room, which is completely devoid of human occupants, glimmer in the shadowy light, seem to imbue the surrounding atmosphere with an absolutely palpable aura of mystery. The next two, please. And I think this sort of this is when he comes closest to mainline symbolism. So again, in this painting on the left, landing of the staircase that the Rue de Romilly, which is an apartment building in time, this mother could well be the figure of the mother, the shadowy figure of Madame Vuillard emerging into this area, this rather dramatically lit space. And that's the lighting effect's even more dramatic in the tiny little painting on the right, again about 4 by 6 inches. intensify the mood and to bring out some sort of hidden but not easily defined emotional content. This was recognized by the critic Gustave Le Roy at the time, who referred to the sursaut magique de lumière, the magical springs of light, as a very distinctive feature of Vuillard's painting at this time. And I think all of this kind of dramatic light effects, the emphasis on silhouettes and shadows, is a great deal to do with his work in the experimental sort of Strindberg theatre. We have the next two. We want a very different kind of mood here in these two decorative panels, but just about the same date as the works we were just looking at. It's around 1892. We mostly think of Vuillard as an artist who worked on a small scale, but he was surprisingly successful in translating his intimate vision and sense of the interior into larger decorative works. Like many of his contemporaries, Vuillard was involved in a re-evaluation of the whole notion of decorative that gained momentum throughout the 90s, and which can be seen as part of a broader anti-elitist program which stressed that the artist should not confine himself to painting alone, hence no active involvement in the decorative arts. Vuillard, in fact, made designs for dinner service, stained glass, and decorative screens, amongst other things. But in fact, for most of the Navi, their greatest ambition was not to paint very small paintings, but to make murals in the tradition of grand-scale decoration. Vuillard's brilliant sense of the decorative, I think, is immediately apparent. His first decorative commission was a series of 6 overdrawn panels commissioned by the architect Courtauld Institute of Art, 2 of which we see here. They're not actually so very large. These are only about 4 feet wide each. As you see, he then goes on to work on a much larger scale, but nevertheless, in comparison to the very small scale of paintings at this date, it is quite a big jump to suddenly start working on this kind of scale. The orchestration of the figure of the ground, the kind of pairing of opulent pattern with much sort of sparser intervals in between, as well as the wonderfully exaggerated decorative arabesques formed by these figures as they twist and turn along these frieze-like panels. I think they are some wonderful works. They've got oil on panel, and they do have this wonderful jewel-like richness when you can actually see them. Of course, they owe a lot, I think, in all of their decorative work. The Navis were drawing on a lot of different sources, one of which is medieval Magellan panels here, also Japanese scroll painting, and of course Japanese prints, kind of the sort of type of women in highly patterned kimonos that you get in the Hiroshima prints, or rather they were all interested in and even collecting around this time. But I think that he has extraordinary freshness and vivacity that he managed to draw on all of these sources and compound them in a way that they become completely embedded in his own personal language. We have the next two, the kind of Japanese print that they were interested in. The wonderful ink drawing by Vuillard, done about the same time as the panels. You can see where you're getting that kind of free, kind of brushing, sort of caricatural vigor that does come out in the figures of the panel. The next two. He then went on to work on a much bigger scale. This is one of the next major decorative commissions, 4 panels commissioned by Dr. Backes in 1896, known just simply as People in Interiors. One of the sad things about these first 3 Vuillard decorations is that they were designed originally for very specific contexts, very specific rooms, and none of them, I think, are still in their original settings. However, at least with this series of 4 panels, they are all still together. You can see them all together at the Petit Palais in Paris. But even on this much bigger scale, I can't remember exactly, these are probably about 6 to 8 feet high, something like that. We see that he is still very successful in sustaining sense of the intimate. A couple of years before painting these, he had referred in his journal to the medieval tapestries which he had admired in the Museum of Art. And he particularly admired them for their humble subjects and the fact that they succeeded in retaining a sentiment intime, even on a very large surface. And so the tapestries also, in addition to the sources I've already mentioned, are a very important source for Vuillard, particularly Vuillard's decorative work, with this very close interweaving of brushwork, as has often been observed, but justly, I think, is like the tapestry maker's stitch. Of course, the Pouilly de Chavannes' serenely timeless idyls were another important example in Minardi's formulation of the decorative. And in their wish to endow modern monumental subjects with the weight of tradition, they found in Seurat, the Vuillard of 1884, and La Grande Jatte of 1886, recent and compelling examples. Like Seurat's paintings, the people and interiors are also vegetation in a way on the contemporary and timeless. It's a very contemporary subject of women in these rich, overstuffed bourgeois fin de siècle interiors, and yet there's something about the technique that gives them this sort of frozen quality of being outside of time, suspended in a moment of time. This owes something to the actual technique Vuillard was using. They're painted in coal, or in French word in coal, but what is it? In English, I think translated usually as distemper, glue-based distemper. It's a somewhat elaborate procedure that involves mixing powdered pigment with melted down side. And Vuillard had first come across it as a scene painter with the Théâtre de l'Œuvre, but he found that he liked its sort of refinement, its very nuanced colours he would get, and its lack of a reflective surface, so that it keeps a very, very flat, matte surface. It has quite an effect on the colours, but it's very, very powdery hues, where the colours are sometimes almost reduced just to a nuance. It's as if one is looking at almost a scrim, so that the fin de siècle richness of the fabrics and flowers fades into a kind of veil, sort of poeticizing veil of memory that transposes this bourgeois scene into a dream, something like a glimpse of just half remember, tinged with a certain mood of nostalgia. Again, it is more, as with the kind of the planar overlapping and interlocking of forms that we saw in the paintings we were looking at a few minutes ago. The result he achieves is something which seems more attuned to subjective experience than to actual immediate vision. I'd like to read you now a few, I think, very eloquent words written by André Gide as a young man, not in fact about these panels, but about two somewhat similar ones that we are painted about 2 or 3 years later. But nevertheless, his words apply, I think, and do capture beautifully this reticence, this sense of interiority, which is so essential to Vuillard's aesthetic. He is the most personal, the most intimate of storytellers. I know few pictures which bring the observer so directly into conversation with the artist. I think it must be because his brush never breaks free of the emotion which guides it. The outer world for Vuillard is always a pretext, an adjustable means of expression. And above all, it's because Monsieur Vuillard speaks almost in a whisper, as is only right when confidences are being exchanged, and we have to bend over toward him to hear what he said. And the next two. These are two of another decorative ensemble of 5 panels this time, now sadly dispersed, that were commissioned by Thaddée Natanson in 1895. Natanson was the publisher and editor of the very successful at the time avant-garde periodical La Revue Blanche, and Vuillard's friendship with him and with his wife Amicia brought him into a very brilliant circle of writers and painters in Paris at the end of the 1890s. And it was within this circle, this environment, that he produced latest paintings. The one on the left is a very long frieze-like composition, about 6 or 7 feet wide, called the Album, which was in the Annenberg collection and is now probably in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And on the right, the striped blouse from the National Gallery in Washington. Another panel is in the Museum of Modern Art, and I think the remaining 2 are now in Japan. Again, we see how successful Vuillard was at the extension of this interior vision of a very enclosed bourgeois world to a public, large-scale dimension. Of course, again, we are deprived of seeing the decorations in their original context, where they are very much a reflection. I mean, they are a painting of the room in which they were destined to hang. So they must have seemed like extensions or even mirror images of these very rich, sumptuous bourgeois interiors. In the album on the left, you see in the center, that's difficult to make up the figures. They're so closely embedded with the surrounding texture. But there are 3 women sitting on a sofa looking at an album on a book. Another woman on the right arranges flowers, and 2 others are grouped to the far left. In all of the panels, young women in striped blouses go about these leisurely, civilized tasks within these richly textured interiors, embellished with a continuous presence of flowers, all of them autumnal chrysanthemums, their warm copper tones underscoring the central palette of all 5 words. It has been suggested that all of the women in these panels are variants of a single figure, Misia, the captivating wife of Télématin, of whom Vuillard was quietly enamored. She seems to fuse with her lush surroundings in a hermetic world of domestic ease. Again, an analogy of tapestry comes to mind, I think. The actual way it would work, is this one in particular, I've looked at more closely, is painted and it's calibrated with brushwork, beautifully understated, and laid out with a complex weave of light brushstrokes with very little build-up of paint. I realise it's rather ineffectual, perhaps talking this sort of physical detail about a slide, because none of this sort of stuff, like nuance and texture, really comes out of the slide, but you don't see that that's quality. Above ground seems to have been scraped away, and most obviously in the large bouquet of flowers here, and to the left down here, over which the pigments are laid without underpainting or without modulating tones. You get certain sudden sensuous rich lines of colour, like this rusty red contour along the top of the sofa there, which has a little more weight than the rest. But on the whole, Vuillard achieves a very balanced interplay of 2-dimensional pattern. It gives a sort of seamless and fluid quality that has caused his work often to be compared, and effectively, I think, not only to the poetry of Mallarmé, but also to the music of Debussy. The work is virtually without a narrative text, except perhaps for a hint in the box here, which could be a florist box in which the chrysanthemums arrive, whose 3-dimensionality insets, just for a moment, the overall 2-dimensional weave. Looking at this work, I think we realise that much of Vuillard's great power to seduce lies in his ability to mysteriously suggest a glimpse of something, a moment that we only half understand. The next 2 pieces. One senses that as a regular, highly receptive, though apparently very silent guest at the NYSS soirees, Vuillard saw, or perhaps just sensed, things that were filtered through his memory and imagination. And it is the feeling of experience transformed that lies at the heart of paintings such as these, both of the Misia painted around 1897. Misia was a young Polish pianist who was taught by Hohlt, a very vivacious and charming, talented woman who was a muse to several artists and writers in the circle of La Rue Blanche, including Toulouse-Lautrec, Joan, and Mallarmé. Vuillard's attachment for her and the beautiful and sensual paintings he made of her toward the end of the 90s often seem to be filled with a sort of suppressed yearning. In these pictures, the taut and claustrophobic spaces of the earlier Navi interiors now relax into a looser and more the Natasson salon is transformed by Vuillard into an exotic chamber hung with richly patterned wallpapers and fabrics and lit with the soft glow of yellow lamps. We see out here is one of the serpentine form lying on this couch, or quite a magical presence in that white dress on the right. In the next two, or she sits at her piano, enveloped in this sort of shower, a golden shower of sound and light. And here is a photograph on the right of Tunisian Talley Natanson in their salon, which is the subject of so many of his paintings. You see that he's quite close to the actual perceptual experience, and yet the extent to which they take on this kind of poetic veiling in the painting. The painting on the wall in the background, by the way, is the album, the big frieze decoration that we were just looking at on the left. Next two. Shock. On the left is again a lush bourgeois interior painted by Vuillard in 1926. Madame André Bernsa, children, and on the right is the Renoir Children's in 1876. And I want to turn now in the second part of the lecture to look at these later works. They remain a puzzle, I must say, an interesting one, but to try to sort of look at continuities with the earlier work and perhaps see what took Vuillard in this direction. While the appeal of the early work remains so potent with their inwardness, states of feeling they exude can still be understood today, as I'm trying to explain. The later works have been much more of a problem to contemporary eyes. I say the later work, but in fact we're talking about by far the greater part of Vuillard's production, from around 1900 until his death in 1940, as opposed to the work we have just been looking at, which was produced in a single decade. The general view is that in the latter part of his career, Vuillard's work fell off severely, and that the originality and force of the Navi period were entirely lost. Pictures such as the one on the left have earned him the reputation of an accomplished but shallow portrayer of Parisian society. Although in a sense such works do show a continuity with the early work, after all the subject is more or less the same, they are still about the bourgeois interior, but the whole atmosphere and mood is very different. The space, lighting are all more conventional, and above all, the intensity and the resonance of the early work seems to have been drained away. Late work has often been considered a little more than a worn-out legacy of Impressionism. Though this is an oversimplification, it is true that one of the things that clearly lies behind such a painting as this is a reappraisal of Impressionism. The conservative climate between wars in France fostered a great revival of interest in the Impressionists, particularly Renoir, who was now revered as an old master, admired for his technique of métier and his belle de peinture. Madame Wanzer and her children, portrait of society hostess with her children in her elegant Paris drawing room, is a sort of Madame Charpentier revisited. The walls of Madame Wanzer's drawing room are in fact hung with Impressionist paintings, including, I think, 2 or 3 works by Renoir. Contemporary critics, surprising when you go through the periodical literature of the 20s and 30s, how very frequently Vuillard is compared to Renoir. A comparison which was generally thought of as favourable in this conservative climate. Such comparisons were based on the ingratiating charm of Vuillard's subjects, as well as his technical virtuosity, fluency and luminosity of his paint, especially in the rendering of fine silks and the effects of indoor lighting. Vuillard's own absorption in Renoir is part, too, of his broader accessible tradition in these years. The traditions learned from a lifetime of visiting the Louvre were increasingly important to him in the latter part of his career, as he linked himself to a larger sense of his artistic heritage. It is noticeable that in the later books of the journal, his allegiance has shifted away from such anti-Nice masters as Chardin and Vermeer, who lie behind so much of his early work, to the great 17th century figure painters Courtauld, Wich, and Lebrun, and the more painterly and sensual tradition that can be traced from the Venetians, especially Veronese, through Watteau and Wich, and ultimately to Renoir. The spirit of these traditions can be felt in Vuillard's daily work, not in specific borrowing so much, but in a richer, more sonorous palette and a greater amplitude of form, as well as a new emphasis on composition and finish. Next two, please. I'm jumping back a bit here. Here is an interior by Vuillard of around 1905, and a nude of Bonheur around 1908 on the right. In their search for new direction, for all of the Navi were engaged in the search for new direction around the turn of the century, around 1900. And they all of them turned in different ways to the naturalism they had rejected in their early youth. As Vuillard moved away from a concentration on claustrophobic interiors, he turned to a more expansive range of subjects, landscape, still life portraits, and interiors flooded with daylight, like the portrait of his brother-in-law, Xavier Roussel, and his daughter Annette, which you see on the left. Bonheur, too, was engaged in the reassessment of Impressionism. On the right is his nude of 1908. Both compositions are filled with air and with radiant light, executed in a high-key palette with loose brushwork, and they seem to celebrate the artist's release from the impressive confines of their Navi interiors. A statement made by Bonheur in 1908 could equally well apply to Vuillard. When we discovered Impressionism, it was a new enthusiasm, a sensation of discovery and liberation. For Gauguin as a classic, almost a traditionalist, and Impressionism brought us liberty. And it's a very interesting statement because they see something, Impression as something that very much that they discovered after Gauguin. As young artists, they seem not to have been interested in Impressionism, although it must have been around in the galleries in Paris in the 1880s, they just didn't seem to have picked up on it. It was already classic. And the influence, of course, of Gauguin's couture was absolutely overwhelming in the formation of their Navi style. Next two. Vuillard was always extremely receptive to the social environment in which he found himself. And it always seemed to have a marked impact on the way that his art developed. For example, in the 1890s when he was mixing this very sort of high club and union set, Nathan Bonheur, Navi, etc. I think he needed that catalyst to produce something that was certainly within him, but to produce works of that sort of intensity and originality. He now moved in a very different social world, and I think it's a lot to do with the marked shift that did begin to occur in his art around the turn of the century. The brilliant world of Nathan and Guggenheim had begun to fall apart around this date, around 1900. The magazine actually ceased publication in 1903 owing to financial pressure, and shortly thereafter, the Italian Nathan divorced, and it was the end of that world. So Vuillard soon found himself in a new milieu, by which the focus for him was my artist herself in his photograph of her. And it was a portrait of her made, I think, that same summer of 1908 in Normandy. She was the wife of Just Hessel, the director of the Bernheim German Gallery. She was a strong-willed, affectionate, but temperamental woman, but who was to become Vuillard's very close friend and confidant, his lifelong daily companion, although whether or not they actually had a physical relationship remains open to speculation, and the journal offers no clues whatsoever. Lucy and her friends in her grand apartment on the Rue de Liberty in Paris and at her houses in Versailles, Normandy, provided Vuillard not only with the subject of his art, but with a new way of life, which, though grander than what he was used to, still gave him the domestic intimacy which was so essential to his well-being. In Vuillard's many portraits of Lucy, it is her imposing physical presence, her stylishness, her self-assurance, and her ease within the secure and comfortable world she inhabited that Vuillard tends to bring out. That Lucy dominated his social as well as his emotional life is clear from the almost daily references to her in the journals, in which he records their numerous social engagements and his response to her continuous shifts of mood. Next to Vuillard's connection with the Bernard Gallery had considerable bearing on the development of his new impressionistic style. Felix Fenion's in charge of the contemporary department, and he made the Bernard Gallery the foremost gallery in Paris devoted to Impressionism, the forebears of Impressionism, and its inheritors. But all the former Navi, it was Bonnard and Vuillard particularly espoused Impressionism, and together with Signac, Marquet, and Matisse, they formed part of a loose coterie of painters working at this style, who exhibited at the gallery. On the left is an interior by Vuillard around 1912, Famille Travieux. And on the right I showed that Matisse, the Moorish Queen, painted at the Nice period around 1921, which I think has a lot of similarity with Vuillard. I thought it interesting to bear in mind, rather obvious fact, of course, that all the years Vuillard was associated with the Bernard Gallery, for the years that saw the rise of Cubism and later in the 1920s, the development of Surrealism. And yet all of these artists showing at Bernard were involved with this conservative trend, a retour à l'ordre, a return to order, which persisted in France in the interwar years. One does perhaps an echo in the Vuillard of the Navi work in the way the white figures of the girl seems almost sort of embedded in the pattern of the oriental rug and in the rich setting of its strong, dense colour. But the whole sense of space, atmosphere, and light is, of course, entirely different. Not only did the gallery give these artists regular exhibitions, but they also regularly showed the old masters of the Impressionism. Vuillard wrote rather disconsolately in his diary of 1907, hanging at Guggenheim this evening, disgusted with my painting, with pictures by Bonnard, classic Renoir, brilliant Monet. It's a long time since I received such a harsh lesson. Next two slides. From about 1925 on, Vuillard devoted himself chiefly to portrait commissions, which arose through the Hessels and their circle of affluent friends. Vuillard shared Degas' enthusiasm for Edmond Duranty's very influential book, La Nouvelle Peinture, which, when it was published in 1876, had a tremendous effect on Degas' portraiture. I think Vuillard was actually responsible for reissuing this book sometime in the early 20th century. I'm not sure of the exact date. Anyway, on the right I show you a portrait by Degas, a portrait of the printmaker Diego Martelli, and on the left Vuillard's portrait of the critic Guggenheim Museum of 1912. So that Vuillard picked up on Duranty's ideas that were so important in Degas' portraiture, as I just mentioned, that the natural surroundings are as important a part of the image in a portrait as the figure itself, and that these are essential to the portrayal of the character, as is an emphasis on pose and gesture. So Degas' portrait of Martelli is seen squatting in a slightly workman-like way amid the clutter of the studio. And in his ambition to portray not merely an individual but also a social world, Vuillard, like Degas, allowed his sitters' surroundings to expand the portrayal of character. I don't paint portraits, I paint people at home, he once observed. The commission to paint the famous critic, Édouard Vuillard, in a sense marked the beginning of Vuillard's series of late portraits. Aware of the distinguished artists who had painted during the war, he made a point of including Whistler's elegant portrayal of the critic in 1882, here. He shows Vuillard in a relaxed and typical pose, one presumes, and setting, with a now elderly critic at his desk surrounded by books, a black cat on his knee. The mise en page also reminds us of Degas' famous portrait, actually of Duranty, and this is in the Barrow collection in Glasgow. I'm afraid I couldn't find the slide of this. After his first meeting with Vuillard, Vuillard noted in his journal, Balzacian interior, pile of books, and indeed Balzac's favourite literary device of using detailed inventories of a setting to indicate the character and habits of its occupant had similarities to Vuillard's own approach to the portrait. Next two, please. On the left, portrait of Claude Lehman Foundation, about 1908, and the later work, I think, about 1970, I'm guessing, I think, of Madame Bernard on the right. The technique he used in most of his late portraits is again the cone, the distemper suspended in the powder pigment suspended in a glue binder. It's a complicated and difficult medium to use, involved keeping the glue heated constantly on stove as he worked. But we are like this technique, as I mentioned, for its flat, chalky, and non-reflective surface. It was slow drying, so it allowed for a lot of revisions in the initial stages, but once dry, it became very intractable. And Vuillard's later work, I think, some of you can see the portrait themselves, but certainly from the sketches and his comments in his journal, are patently filled with a great deal more self-doubt than his early work. And these late portraits are filled with revisions, often involving scraping off this very tough, cold medium and then starting over. Nowadays, this technique poses great problems for conservators, since it has proven to be very fragile over time and very subject to cracking and drying and flaking. However, often in these portraits, we see Vuillard building up very dense layers of distemper, which sometimes give the objects in the sitter's physical surroundings extraordinary physical presence. Again, this is the kind of observation where we really need to be in front of the paintings and not in front of the slides. But the tablecloth, for example, in the portrait of Madame Bernard, is an extraordinarily crusty section of paint, which seems to compete in its sheer physicality with the form of the old lady herself. I think it's this sort of these extraordinary surfaces, these built up surfaces, does have appeal to some contemporary artists. Graham was mentioning before that speaking of Frank Auerbach's admiration for Lake Vuillard, for example, and I think a lot of that has to do with a sense of physicality and materiality rather than subject matter. What Vuillard creates in his works is a world invaded by things, by possessions, by objects. Just as the Navi interior, the space is invaded by pattern and texture, here we get this sort of proliferation of objects, perhaps a reflection of the materiality of the age, or at least the people that we are painting. But there is something very direct here about the way that Vuillard can translate his perceptions into physical matter. And in this kind of integrality between sensation and expression, I think we can find a link with the early work, the way that the figures are so integrated by the sheer physicality of the paint with the surroundings. Another continuity is the texture and the sort of physicality of the paint and the integration of the figure and ground. Sometimes the figures can seem to emerge from the sheer physical substance surrounding them. The young Claude Lehman Foundation on the left, for example, seems almost to owe his existence to a sort of accretion and intensification of the particles of matter of which the sofa he sits on is born. Next slide. Now here we're looking at two very accomplished Vuillard's later portraits. On the left, the Princess de Polignac, and on the right, Anna de Noailles. I feel that Vuillard always had a need to identify in a profound way with the milieu in which he found himself. And in these portraits made in interval years, he captures not just the likenesses of the individuals, but the appearance of the whole society, one redolent of a certain bonheur de vivre, but within the confines of its upholstered drawing rooms is it somehow at ease of itself. The perpetuation of this image of society took on a special significance in the period after the First World War, when the defeat of the Germans seemed to have ensured the continuity of a much cherished way of life. Like Renoir, what Vuillard was seen by conservative critics as the purveyor of a certain notion of sensuality and grace, through which areas of the privileged world could be transformed into an art for delectation. The conservative critic Tristan Leclerc, for example, was moved to observe, as music is made for the delectation of the ear, Édouard Vuillard wants to make painting for the delectation of the eye. Although the late portraits were, I should add, by no means universally well received at the time, Pierre Courtauld, for example, described Vuillard as a portrait salesman, a painter, assembler, and an executor of commissions. Vuillard's method in these later portraits seems to have involved to start with a quick general sketch of the overall composition, usually in a small sketchbook, combined with copious verbal notes made in the journal. He would then put together a dossier of numerous small sketches of details of the figure and setting. But much of the actual painting is done away from the model in the studio, where, as at his early work, Vuillard allowed the process of memory to interact with his observations. The Princess de Polignac left an account of Vuillard. She noticed that he specifically asked her not to change anything in the objects around her. So, the numerous he took a very long time to paint this painting. He finished off in 1928 and finished on 1936. And during that time, he went, I'm not sure for all of those years, but certainly several years, would go to her apartment almost every day, usually for only about 20 minutes, to make more of these expensive, used, but often very delicate, beautifully drawn sketches. Finally, in the final portrait is different from his initial concept. He set her much further back in her room, with the unfortunate result, according to one critic, that she appeared as if seen through the wrong end of the telescope, engulfed by her belongings. In the portrait of the poetess Anna de Noailles, who, like her friend and contemporary Marcel Proust, always did her writing in bed, again the sitter commented on Vuillard's obsessive passion for exactitude and the way that he insisted that none of her bedside clutter should be disturbed between sittings. Usually, Vuillard did not make large compositional sketches of his paintings, but in the case of the portrait of Anna de Noailles, he did make a very finished, large charcoal drawing here, just about the same size as the painting, which is now in the Louvre. And I mentioned this here because in the exhibition downstairs is a very similar drawing. It's a very resolved charcoal drawing on a large scale. The subject is Vuillard's friends, the Terrace family. And this probably was also intended as a study for a painting. Although I don't know the painting, I'm not sure if it was ever realized, but it was unusual for Vuillard to work in that way. Next slide. Much more commonly practiced. Here I am showing some works that you can't see downstairs. Not the pictures of pastel, in fact, the telegram gives this niece or daughter. But we do have downstairs a whole group of these small, very detailed sketches that is working out all of the different details of the composition. So you see here the arm. We have the next two on the right, succession, head, and the next one. Yes, even the whole series of drawings where he's working out some detail, the motif of the frames of the paintings. Vuillard complains frequently in his journal about how tedious he found these many portrait commissions. And the question is why he allowed them to absorb so much of his activity. That remains a perplexing one. Any idea that they were undertaken as meretricious exercises is belied by the general entries that testify to his unrelenting effort and constant anxiety about them. Words such as anguish, torment, despair, and disarray crop up again and again in the journals when he writes about the portraits. While the pictures themselves show no sign of their maker's anxiety, this anxiety is reflected, I think, in his complex and obsessive way of working, in the masses of small sketches he made, the nervous line of his drawing, the numerous sessions with sitter and his ability to ever consider a work completed. And there does seem to be a sort of obsessive concern with specificity, the need to fix and possess the minutiae of the subject, the details of the frame, the kind of things we're looking at here. So that his art seems now much more to do with exterior phenomena than with the internal states of being that was so important to him early on. He now seems to be caught up in seizing these objective phenomena, so there's no room really, or not so much room anyway, for the free play of imagination and memory. Although in many ways the subjects he chose to depict remained constant throughout his life, the intimate world of family and friends and domestic interiors, what is often lacking in the late portraits is the presence in the work of Vuillard's self, and that multiple layering of personal suggestion that is so totally felt in the family interiors. Because of this, those portraits in which Vuillard's personal investment is less, I think that's true of the two we were just looking at, rather formal conditions, are obviously the least satisfactory. Next two. However, these are two scenes of various houses of the Hessel. This is the Rue de Rivoli apartment, and I think this is the house in Versailles, so I'm looking at one of the country houses. To the end of his life, though, Vuillard's method of painting did involve a protracted immersion, initial immersion of the subject, followed by a gradual integration of his intuitions and reactions. And when, in his late work, he was able to draw on a subject that was complete with meaning for him personally, he continues to sustain this highly developed bourgeois vision of interiority, which I think these paintings do possess. They're very accomplished paintings in their way. And I think they are filled with this warmth and familiarity of private association, which somehow gives them more depth. They resonate more to me at any rate than some of the other portraits we've been looking at. There's a continuity here, I think, it is possible to find a continuity here between the early and the late work. And another link is the sense of theatre, which the avant-garde theatres we saw contributed so much to the dramatic intensity of the Nazi period paintings, but it continues to be felt in a different way in the late work. The visit here on the left of 1938, I said a scene of the CSL apartment, he transforms a familiar, intimate subject of his early years, the domestic interior, into an imposing theatrical tableau. It's almost like a still from a movie. It has something kind of somehow lifted out of just the rhythm of the familiar somehow. The mise en scène is now, however, a bourgeois comedy of manners, rather than a psychological drama of Ibsen or Strindberg. The claustrophobic and opaque Mellonean suggestiveness found in the Navi work has given way to an expansiveness of feeling that shows Vuillard's ease and engagement with his subject, expressed through the relaxed and logical space and the orchestration of sumptuous power. In his late, as in his early work, Vuillard continued to be fascinated by artificial light. But now the somber and moody effects of gaslight are replaced by the even and sophisticated rhythms of electricity. In such a painting from the end of Vuillard's career, the themes of his early work are recapitulated and transformed. The Cubist painter and critic André Lout noted that in the late work, the life of the interior, rather than the interior life, absorbs most of Vuillard's activity. And it is true that it is difficult to reconcile Vuillard, the old master, with Vuillard, the radical innovator of the 1890s. It seems that in the 1890s, a particular coming together of artistic and intellectual currents was especially in tune with Vuillard's artistic identity, acting as a catalyst which was able to touch the inner core of his sensibilities. But later in life, unlike Bonnard, who retreated to the south of France to elaborate his art from the private, self-contained world he constructed for himself, Vuillard was to a much greater extent dependent for his inspiration on the external factors of the Parisian social milieu. In this environment, which was committed in so many ways that the values of the past, Vuillard came increasingly to rely on tradition as his quest for innovation diminished. So despite the connections that I think can be made between the early and the late work, and the masterful assurance of these late paintings, I think in the end it has to be said that they are not so deeply rooted in the subject, in the artist's subjective self, and as a result, they lack both the complexity of pictorial form and that psychological penetration that distinguishes the tiny paintings of the 1890s.